The banquet hall had this bad string light situation, the kind that flickers just enough to notice. And it was 8:41 p.m. on a Saturday in June, 79 degrees inside, because the air conditioning couldn't keep up with 200 bodies, and a dance floor that hadn't opened yet. I was holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching my father stand up at the head table, tap a butter knife against his glass, and clear his throat for the toast. "To Danielle and Marcus," he said, "we've got one more gift for you tonight. The house. Paid off. Free and clear. No strings attached. Your mother and I want you starting your marriage without a mortgage hanging over your heads." The room erupted into applause. Someone whistled. Danielle pressed both hands to her mouth. Actual tears. And Marcus pulled her into a hug, while my mother beamed from her seat, like she'd just watched her own life's purpose complete itself. I sat very still. I set my champagne glass down on the white tablecloth, careful not to let it clink. Because here's what none of them knew. In that flickering banquet hall, applauding a gift that cost my parents nothing, I was the one who'd been paying that mortgage every month for 5 years, and I had never once been told it wasn't mine to inherit. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Petra, 33, a mortgage underwriter from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is the story of how my parents gave away a house I'd secretly kept afloat for half a decade, and how the paperwork trail I understand better than almost anyone ended up telling the truth they didn't want told. If you've ever quietly paid for something that got handed to someone else, stay with me. Drop a comment and subscribe, because the deed tells a very different story than the toast did. I was 12 when Danielle, 9, got a trampoline for her birthday that cost my parents $1,200, and I remember because I'd asked for a bike that same spring and been told, maybe next year, money's tight. That was always the framing in our house. Money was tight for me, and money simply appeared for Danielle, the way weather appears, something nobody questioned the source of. I brought home a 3.98 GPA in high school, worked 22 hours a week at a bank call center starting at 17 to pay for my own car insurance, and got into a solid state university on a partial academic scholarship that covered maybe a third of tuition Sahiti. The rest, I financed myself, working through all 4 years and graduating with $31,000 in student loans. I paid off entirely on my own by 28. Danielle got a car for her 16th birthday, a 5-year-old Honda, but a car nonetheless, something I never received at any age. She attended 2 years of community college that my parents paid for outright, roughly $9,000, before deciding it wasn't really her thing and dropping out to work retail, a decision my parents described, at the time, as her figuring out what really makes her happy, a phrase I never once heard applied to anything I did. I have a certificate from a regional accounting competition I placed second in during my senior year of high school. It's in a box in my closet. Danielle has a photo from a middle school dance recital, framed, that hung in our living room for over a decade, positioned exactly where anyone walking through the front door would see it first. I don't say any of this looking for pity. I say it because it's the reason that when my father called me 5 years ago and asked quietly if I could help with the mortgage, I said yes, almost before he finished the sentence, some part of me still hoping that being the reliable one might, eventually, get acknowledged as its own kind of belonging. My father took early retirement at 60, a decision he made somewhat unilaterally after a rough year at his engineering firm, and it left him and my mother with a fixed income that didn't come close to covering their $2,150 monthly mortgage payment on the house I grew up in. He called me first, not Danielle, who was, by then, 28 and working an inconsistent retail schedule, and asked if I could help out for a few months while we figure things out. The few months became 5 years. I set up an automatic transfer from my account directly to their mortgage servicer, structured quietly enough that it never showed up as a line item my parents had to explain to anyone, including, as far as I could tell, Danielle. Over 60 months, that came to $129,000 in mortgage payments alone, plus another $6,400 I covered for a roof repair after a bad hailstorm 3 years in, and $3,200 for a furnace replacement the winter after that. All told, by the time of the wedding, I had put $138,600 into a house I did not own, on an understanding my father had stated to me directly more than once over those 5 years. "This'll be yours someday, Petra. You're the one keeping it standing." I believed him. I want to be honest about that, on camera, because I think it matters. I wasn't operating purely out of obligation. I believed there was a plan, and that the plan involved the house eventually being mine, the same way you believe a loan will be repaid, because the person across the table looked you in the eye and said it would be. During those same 5 years, I sat through more than one holiday dinner, where my mother introduced me to new neighbors as our daughter in banking. She's very responsible with money, in a tone that somehow managed to make responsibility sound like a mild character flaw, immediately followed by an introduction of Danielle as our free spirit. She just lights up every room she walks into. At a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers ago, my Aunt Carol asked how my parents were managing on retirement income, and my mother laughed and said, "Oh, we're just very careful budgeters, always have been," while I stood 4 feet away holding a spatula, having wired the mortgage payment covering that exact month 11 days earlier. I never corrected her. I told myself the house would eventually make the correction unnecessary. The wedding was in June, a Saturday, a banquet hall 30 minutes outside Pittsburgh with string lights, and a dance floor that opened, eventually, to a playlist Danielle had spent months curating. I came alone at first, then brought my college best friend Nessa as my +1, when my actual invitation situation with a partner fell through weeks earlier, a detail that turned out to matter later, because Nessa is meticulous, and Nessa was sitting right beside me for every second of what happened next. 40 minutes into the toasts, my father stood, tapped his glass, and announced the house, free and clear, no strings, a gift to Danielle and Marcus to start their marriage without a mortgage. The room applauded. Danielle cried real tears. My mother looked like she'd been waiting her whole life to deliver that sentence. I sat there running the numbers in my head, the way I run numbers professionally, several times a day, for strangers' loan applications. Free and clear meant paid off. Paid off meant someone had paid it off. I was the only person at that table who had been paying anything on that house in 5 years, and no one had paid off the remaining balance. I would have known, because I was the one making the payments, and the automatic transfer I'd set up had gone out as scheduled just 11 days before that wedding. I didn't stand up and say anything. I didn't want to make my sister's wedding day the setting for the worst conversation of my life. And some instinct in me, even in that moment, was already thinking procedurally instead of emotionally. I needed to understand what had actually happened to the house before I said a single word about it. Nessa, beside me, quietly took her phone out and, without saying anything, started a note with the date, the time, and the exact wording of my father's toast. I noticed. I didn't ask her to. She just knew. The way people who've watched you get overlooked for 15 years eventually learn to document things too. I left the reception an hour later, before the cake cutting, hugging Danielle briefly and telling her congratulations, meaning it, because none of what was coming was about her happiness. Nobody at that table asked why I was leaving early. Nobody noticed at all. The following Monday, I did what I do for a living, just aimed at my own family for the first time. I pulled the property records for my parents' house through the county recorder's site, something I have access to through work, but that's also fully public record. No special privilege required. What I found stopped me mid-scroll. A deed transfer, filed 6 weeks before the wedding, removing Greg and Ann Kowalski as sole owners, and adding Danielle Kowalski-Reyes and Marcus Reyes as co-owners, notarized, fully executed, dated a full month and a half before my father ever stood up at that reception, which meant the gift hadn't happened at the wedding at all. It had happened quietly, weeks earlier, without me being told, while I continued making a mortgage payment on a house whose ownership had already legally changed hands. A house I no longer had any informal claim to whatsoever, transferred to people who, as far as I could tell, had no idea the mortgage on their paid-off wedding gift was still actively being paid by their sister-in-law. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Danielle. I logged into the automatic transfer I'd set up 5 years earlier and canceled it that same afternoon, the same procedural way I'd cancel any autopay on a closed account, because that's exactly what this now was, a closed account, as far as any informal understanding I'd been operating under was concerned. I sent one email, not to my parents, but to myself, time-stamped, laying out what I'd found and what I intended to do next. Because in my line of work, you always document your own reasoning before you document anyone else's. Word moved fast once the mortgage payment didn't hit that month. My mother called first, polite, confused sounding, asking if there'd been some kind of bank error. I let that call go to voicemail. By the following week, according to Nessa, who still had a group chat with some of my cousins, the story circulating was that I'd abandoned my parents financially, out of nowhere, right after Danielle's wedding. So petty. With zero mention of the deed transfer, zero mention of 5 years of $2,150 monthly payments, zero mention of anything except a sudden, inexplicable cruelty on my part. I didn't respond to a single message. I didn't post anything. Didn't call my cousins to explain. Didn't even respond to my mother's third voicemail, which had shifted from confused to sharp, asking why I was punishing the family for no reason. Instead, I built a folder, 5 years of bank statements, the automatic transfer setup confirmation, the roof and furnace repair receipts, and finally, the deed transfer document itself, printed and dated, and I didn't share it with anyone yet. I have learned, in 11 years of underwriting loans, that the person who presents documentation without commentary is always more credible than the person who explains themselves loudly, and I intended to be the credible one when this finally came to a head. My colleague Frank, who'd trained me when I started at the bank and had become something like a work uncle over the years, noticed I was distracted that week and asked what was going on. When I told him, the mortgage, the wedding toast, the deed filed 6 weeks early, he didn't say, "That's awful." He said, "You need a real estate attorney, not just a folder. I know someone good." The someone good was Priya Anand, a real estate attorney Frank had worked with on several complicated refinance disputes. I brought her the deed transfer and my 5 years of payment records, and within a day, she'd found something I'd missed in my first read-through of the filing. The deed transfer had been executed using a quitclaim form that, per Pennsylvania law, transferred ownership interest, but did absolutely nothing to address the existing mortgage lien, which remained solely in my parents' names, on a loan I had been the one actually servicing. In plain terms, my parents had given away a house whose mortgage they were still legally responsible for and had not paid off, and had not disclosed to Danielle and Marcus, was still an active, unresolved debt. A debt that, as of my cancellation the week prior, was now 30 days delinquent and climbing toward default, sitting on a house that now legally belonged to my sister and her new husband. Priya asked me directly, had my parents ever formally documented, in writing, any promise that the house would eventually be mine in exchange for the payments? I had to tell her no. Everything had been verbal. "This'll be yours someday, Petra." The kind of promise that feels ironclad across a kitchen table and evaporates the moment it needs to hold up anywhere else. What I did have, Priya pointed out, was something almost as useful. 5 years of consistent, documented payments made directly to a mortgage on a property I had no ownership interest in, payments my parents had never disclosed to Danielle, on a loan that was now in active delinquency because of a deed transfer executed without my knowledge, on a house being publicly represented as a debt-free gift. Priya said plainly, "This isn't really about what you're owed emotionally anymore. This is a delinquent loan on a piece of property, and someone needs to tell your sister that before the bank does it for her. I want to be clear about what I did next, because it was not petty, and it was not designed to punish Danielle. It was designed to make sure the actual facts of the loan reached the actual current owners before a default notice did." Priya drafted a formal letter, sent to my parents and, separately and simultaneously, to Danielle and Marcus directly as the new legal owners of record, laying out the payment history, the cancellation date, and the 30-day delinquency status of the mortgage now attached to their home. It wasn't accusatory. It was, in Priya's words, just the facts a title company would eventually surface anyway, delivered by us first, instead of by a default notice. My father called within an hour of the letter arriving, furious in a way I'd rarely heard from him, accusing me of trying to ruin your sister's marriage right out of the gate, and demanding I just restart the payment like a normal person. I let him finish. Then I said calmly, "The house isn't mine anymore. You made sure of that 6 weeks before the wedding. I'm not paying a mortgage on property I have no legal interest in, and I'm not going to let Danielle find out from a bank letter that her wedding gift comes with $2,150 a month attached that nobody told her about." He hung up on me. I didn't call back. Danielle called 2 days later, and this call was different, quieter, scared, asking if what the letter said was true. I told her everything. The 5 years, the $138,600, the verbal promise, the deed filed 6 weeks before her wedding without my knowledge. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They told us it was paid off. They said that at the reception, in front of everyone." We agreed to a meeting the following week at Priya's title company office, neutral ground, all of us present, to sort out what the house actually was now, and what, if anything, anyone owed anyone. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room at Priya's office, 7 of us around a table considerably less festive than a wedding banquet hall. My parents, Danielle, Marcus, Priya, Nessa, who I'd asked to come as a witness given her contemporaneous notes from the wedding toast, and me. Priya opened by laying out the mortgage delinquency, now 41 days past due, and the deed transfer timeline, filed 6 weeks before the wedding toast that had described the house as a debt-free gift. She read the exact language of the quitclaim filing aloud, dry and procedural, and let the dates speak for themselves. My father tried first. "We were going to tell them about the mortgage eventually," he said. "It wasn't a big deal." "You told 200 people at a wedding it was paid off," I said. My first words in the room. Flat, even. It wasn't paid off. I paid it every month for 5 years, and you gave the house away 6 weeks before that toast, without telling me the informal arrangement we'd had for half a decade was over. My mother tried next, her voice rising. "You're really going to do this to your sister? Over a house?" "I'm not doing anything to Danielle," I said. "Danielle didn't know either. You didn't tell either of us the truth. You just told us different halves of it." I looked at Danielle. "I told you everything on the phone. I'm not asking you to give me the house. I'm asking our parents to stop pretending the mortgage doesn't exist." Marcus, who'd said almost nothing until then, turned to my father and asked quietly, "Did you know it was still 41 days delinquent when you stood up and said it was paid off?" My father didn't answer that directly. What he said instead was, "I assumed Petra would just keep covering it," which landed in that room exactly as badly as it should have, because it confirmed in his own words that the entire gift had always depended on labor. Nobody had bothered to ask me to keep providing after quietly cutting me out of the deed. Danielle set her water glass down and looked at our parents for a long moment. "You told 200 people it was paid off," she said, echoing me, quiet and precise. "And it wasn't. And you knew that when you said it. The resolution, once the emotion cleared, was almost entirely procedural, which felt right, given how the whole thing started. Danielle and Marcus, once they understood the full mortgage balance, $187,000 remaining, chose to refinance the property in their own names within the following 2 months, qualifying on their own combined income with a modest co-sign assist from Marcus's father, closing out the delinquency and formally severing any remaining financial thread between me and that house. It was, finally, actually theirs, mortgage and all, honestly this time. My parents' relationship with Danielle cooled considerably once she understood the full shape of what they'd let her walk into. My father's relationship with me stayed frozen for months. My mother, to her limited credit, eventually admitted, in a call I didn't expect, that "we should have told you the deed was already done before the wedding. That part wasn't right. which is not an apology, exactly, but was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from either of them in 5 years. As for me, I recovered nothing financially. The $138,600 is gone, and I never pursued repayment, partly because Priya was honest, that a verbal promise wouldn't hold up as a claim, and partly because I decided, somewhere in that conference room, that I didn't want the house anymore anyway, not after what getting it would have required. What I got instead was something smaller and steadier. Danielle, calling me now more than she ever has, asking real questions, no longer performing a role our parents had scripted for either of us for 30 years. It's been 8 months since that meeting. Danielle and Marcus are settled into the house, mortgage refinanced, deed clean, no secrets left in the paperwork. I finally framed that second-place accounting certificate from high school. It's on my office wall now, next to my underwriting license, 2 pieces of paper that took entirely too long to feel like they belonged in the same room. I don't think my parents ever fully understood what they cost themselves that Saturday in June. Not the house, the trust, the years, the quiet decade of being the reliable one who never once got asked what she actually needed in return. Family isn't the people whose name is on the deed. It's the people who tell you the truth about what's still owed, even when the truth is inconvenient at someone else's wedding. If you've ever quietly kept something standing for years, only to watch it get handed to someone else at a party, you already know that the paperwork always tells the real story eventually. It just sometimes takes someone who knows how to read it. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever paid for a gift they never got credit for. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have said at that reception. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more where this came from.